Showtime! The Capital G show starts right now.
What's up YouTube? Capital G here. We're talking about setting monsters in this video, and it's a current trend that is, over the last month it's kind of like blown up, and we're going to talk about why this mechanic has had such a resurgence over the last few weeks. Now, if you guys have been playing this game for a little while, you would know that for a very, very, very long time, it was pretty much taboo to try and set a monster. It was just something that you only did when you were getting your ass handed to you, with only a few exceptions. In my opinion, the best one would be Geargia, because armor is just hard as fuck to get over, and the card just pluses for days and days and days. So it was the only one that was really worth the risk. But people really weren't willing to set most of their monsters, or to set monsters in general, flip effects, even monsters that could be reflipped like Geargia armor and put themselves face down, for two very good reasons. Number one, Bear could just easily pop everything that you tried to put in front of it, and then he would just be like, okay, pop, pop, pop. Now I attack and go +1, and Fire Fist was a high tier deck for a very long time. The second being, Mermill basically had their own version of Fire Fist, or at least their own version of handling face-down monsters in Atlantia Marksman, which they could trigger with like half the monsters in the deck, and then they would just pop your guy and go plus, and it would pretty much lead to the same result. So two of the best decks for a very long time in Mermill and Fire Fist both had good answers to setting monsters, and since Sangan was banned, there was pretty much no good generic floater out there that you'd ever want to set, so you couldn't even try and psych your opponent into believing that they shouldn't pop your monster. Enter today, where Geargia is arguably the best deck of the format, and even things like Worms are seeing high-level competitive play, and both of these decks commonly set monsters a lot. And you basically look at it and you're like, okay, well, what's changed? Well, I think that it's two things. The first is the release of the hands and their impact on the meta. Now you can pretty much splash in a 6-card mini engine with a very, very, very high resistance to blind destruction. Your opponent can't just go recklessly popping your face down monsters, if they're going to destroy them, because a lot of times if they hit a fire hand or an ice hand, they can end up in a worse situation than before they pop the monster. And the second is artifacts, and everybody is kind of wanting to experiment with them, and the blue artifact is kind of a bitch to deal with. Literally, it seems like anytime you do anything of importance against the artifact deck, basically the blue guy just shows up and he's like, can't let you do that, Star Fox. And considering you can trigger him from the field with Ignition, or the graveyard with Call of the Haunted, you can pull him straight from the deck with Sanctum and he'll get his effect. Not to mention, he activates on resolution, much like Queen Tiramisu. It makes it incredibly difficult to deal with this card. So summoning something and then having it just get blown up by him, that shit gets old really, really fast. And that's why you're starting to see people set monsters more and more. Not only can you avoid his effect, and that's a huge plus in itself, it's also a much safer play when you're going second, as your opponent will probably already have their back row locked and ready to go. And you guys have played this format. You see how back row has pretty much spiraled out of control. Okay, well, you can potentially summon and make yourself susceptible to the, Solemn Warnings and the Bottomlesses of the world, which is a completely searchable card by like half of the decks in the format now. Or you can just set a monster and you have incurred absolutely no risk. And yeah, I do understand that there's DD Tripole, but don't nobody run that shit, so we ain't even gonna bring that up. Another thing that I think a lot of people overlook as to why setting monsters has become so prominent again, and my Uncle WK Dad really put the spotlight on this, with all of these little mini splashable engines running around, like the hands and the trap tricks. As useful as they might be, they pretty much top out at about 1600 attack. That's really not that high. 1700 attack if you run trap tricks Dianara, but you can't get over a Geargia armor or a Ghost Trick Yangshi or a Worm Yagen with something like that. It's just not gonna get the job done. And if you're running the first two, okay, well, your opponent, just after you attack it, they're just going to flip it back down, flip it up, and just keep making advantage, 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 turn after turn. Eventually, they're going to start outpacing you. And a lot of times what you force your opponent into doing is you force them to incur the risk, because, those monsters aren't going to be able to get the job done. So what does your opponent naturally have to do? They have to go for the high risk, high reward play, which is the Xyz summon, which a lot of the times it's benefiting you, because you know, you're incurring no risk at all by setting your cards. And when your opponent does go for the Exceed Summon, yes, again, it's high reward. They may get over your monster or whatever, but it's also high risk. They now open themselves up to the Bottomless, the Black Horn of Heaven, the Traptrix Nightmare, the Solemn Warnings, which could potentially leave their field, I mean, well, empty, and basically you just be completely at advantage. And then the last thing that I want to touch on is the needle sealing element, to where if your opponent pretty much tries to go ham, and I mean, that's made easier than ever with cards like Soul Charge being introduced into the game, you can pretty much counter them with one card. I mean, it used to be where you didn't see 4 monsters on board, you know, a lot. And now with Soul Charge, a lot of times when your opponent activates it, they're going for like 3 or more monsters. So as long as you have one card, you can keep your guy completely protected while your opponent gets, I mean, well, extra fucked because they lose everything. So let me know what you guys think of this. Do you think that it's good that setting monsters is finally back? You know, decks like Fire Fist and Mermail have pretty much taken the back seat because of the hand cards, and I believe that that is pretty much opened the gateway to, you know, decks like Worms and, you know, decks like Frogs and Geargia and stuff like that. Thank you guys for watching as always. Subscribing makes life happy.